Audi TT Mk1 3.2 front brake pad replacement for beginners.
Hi all, Andy here and welcome back to the channel where tonight I am covering the replacement of the front brake pads on the 3.2 V6. Obviously, stopping is a pretty important part of your driving. I've owned this car for getting on for 1 year now, and one of the advisories on the previous MOT, which was last October, was the brake pads were getting low. That's brake pads on the front and the back, but this video is just covering the replacement of the front pads. This video is aimed at the total beginner because replacing brakes is a bit of a scary thought for someone that doesn't really know what they're doing. However, replacing brake pads is not that difficult a job, which you can do at home with a few simple hand tools which I'll list in the video now.
Most of these hand tools you are likely to have already, possibly without the exception of the piston retraction tool, but you could borrow one or use a G-clamp, rated about 3 out of 5 for difficulty.
Now the discs on the front of the 3.2 measure 334mm. That's the standard discs on the 3.2. When I'm replacing the pads, I've gone for a set of Brembo pads. Now I don't know an awful lot about brake makes, but Brembo is one that I'm well aware of. Unless you are upgrading your discs, most of the reputable pads from the makes you will know are equally good. First thing we need to do is get the car in the garage, get it up on the jacks and secure the wheels. Before I start, you will notice I've got changed into old clothes, and the reason for that is this is a messy job, or can be, so it's worth getting changed out of your best clothes. I'm starting on the driver's side of the car at the front, so I need to loosen the 5 road wheel bolts before I get it off the ground. A top tip would be, if you've got a locking wheel nut for your wheels, always keep the key in the small centre console compartment. You'll always know it's there, and whenever you finish this job, remember to put it back. You're not scrabbling around the roadside trying to fix this problem. To ensure this car goes nowhere when it's on the jack, I'm going to put a pair of wheel chocks around one of the wheels to make sure it stays put. Now I have done a video on how and where to jack the Audi TT, so if you want to check out that link, click the link above. When I recently changed these wheels, I did put some copper grease on the hubs to stop the alloy sticking to the hubs. I'm hoping it's going to come off nice and easy. So that's how easy the wheel comes off when you've copper greased the back of the hub. Now my light is quite bright, but if we're talking about the brakes and how they work, this is your brake disc. Quite obvious, I know, disc shape, and this is your brake caliper. And the principle is, you put your foot on the brake, which pumps the hydraulics, fires a piston on the back of the caliper. Inside this caliper, you can see this part here, which is the brake pad, and the piston causes the brake caliper to close and presses the brake pad against the disc, causing friction, causes the car to stop. We are going to remove the caliper and change the pads.
It's important to note that you also need to loosen or remove the cap from the brake fluid reservoir when changing the pads. It's located here under the bonnet. This will allow you to wind the piston back into the caliper once it's off the car, as you'll need to make extra space for the new thicker brake pads.
On a 3.2 we have this retaining clip across the front of the brake caliper, and I've found the best way to remove this is put a screwdriver just in this gap here and pull backwards ever so slightly, and that released it from the top because the pressure of the clip is holding it in place, and that will release the bottom as well. So there's the retaining clip removed. Now I don't think these are factory red calipers, it looks like they've been painted, bad job, but obviously an extra 5 brake horsepower being red. Next thing we need to do is loosen the guide pins from the rear of the caliper so we can remove the part off the caliper that holds the brake pads in place.
The caliper is actually 2 parts. The caliper carrier, which will be staying on the car for this job, but you would remove it if you were changing the disc as well, and the caliper itself, which contains the pistons. If you have standard brakes on your 3.2, the main difference over the 225 and 180, other than the size of the caliper that is the 3.2 has 2 pistons or pots per caliper as opposed to the one on the 225 and 180. So 2 pistons to retract per caliper.
Now the caliper guides or slides are at the top here and at the bottom just here, and they've got a plastic or rubber cap over them to protect them from the elements, like so. Just pull that cap off just like that. Same at the bottom. So that's the 2 caps off. Now the good thing about a GoPro is I can use this to look on the back of the caliper. So I want to look down this tube, because if I look down this tube you can see the Allen key bolt that's the guide of the slide that we need to loosen off.
The top guide pins are a bit fiddly to get off on the 3.2 as the hole has the brake pipe right behind it, preventing you from using a socket wrench and a bar, so use a HW7 size Allen key to undo the bolt. You could remove the brake pipe, but that would mean bleeding the brakes afterwards, which I was trying to avoid.
If your guide pins are stuck, simply feel the guide pin inside the caliper, get a flat screwdriver and just give it a poke out. Just give it a little shove. Now this might be quite stiff because there's a bit of corrosion there you go, that stops it coming out. If we look, there's the guide pin out and you can see it's corroded here. So this is the part that slides backwards and forwards, or the caliper slides backwards and forwards on this pin. So it needs to be nice and smooth. So it's best to get rid of this corrosion so you can wire wool it or put an abrasive wheel on it just to clean it up, and then coat it in some copper grease before reinstalling. But we'll put that to one side. So the top guide pin is free of the mount, but what I'm going to do is just put the screwdriver between the back of the thread and the caliper to push it out. Now be careful of the brake line here, so when you're undoing this make sure that you don't scuff the brake line at all. Again, we'll feed this out and you can see there's a lot of corrosion on that, so again we'll rub all of this down so the caliper slides backwards and forwards nice and easily. With the 2 guide or slide pins out of the way, all I need to now do is prise the caliper away from the carrier. Depending on how locked on your brakes were when you stopped, the pistons inside the caliper are probably engaging the pads quite tightly on the disc. However, I have removed this caliper prior to filming just to make this part of the job easier, but be aware guys, you will take a bit of force to get this off. So the way I do it is I put the screwdriver just behind the back of the caliper and push against the carrier, which should prise it away. Then I take my screwdriver at the bottom, repeat the process, prise the caliper and push against the carrier to back it up. Repeat the process just to get it away, but make sure you're supporting the caliper at all times. And the reason for that is you've got the brake pipe here, and what you don't want to do is leave that taking the full weight of the caliper, and by doing so putting the brake pipe under pressure. So by doing so I'm going to remove this now from my disc, and you'll find that on mine one of the brake pads has remained attached in the carrier and one is actually on the brake caliper itself. So I'm just going to put the caliper up on top of the disc for now so that that brake pipe is not under any strain, like so. And then we can remove this brake pad from the carrier. The idea of the pad is it should be moving with the caliper backwards and forwards in these guidelines. They're full of dirt, dust, and they're causing a lot of resistance. So before we put the new pads on, we will clean these guides up. So let's try and slide it out. It doesn't really slide that well through. There we go. So there's that one off. Now looking at the pad, you can see this groove. There's not a lot of difference between the groove and the material. there's no depth, and I'll show you that compared to the new pad and show you the difference of material that should be on there. Right, here's the first two pads that have come off the car, and we can see, if we look down them, down the groove, that's all that remains. This is all the material that remains. So that's the one on the outside of the car. This is on the inside of the car, pretty much the same level. Now, let's take out a new one from the box and look at that groove down the middle. So if we pick up the old one and the new one side by side, you can see the difference in thickness. Look at the groove, so much more material on that. If I put them together like that, new one, old one, and the wear indicator, I guess, that groove of how much is left is quite evident on that. Loads of wear left on that. So now, supporting the caliper in your hand, that's off. So I'm going to put the brake pad down. I'm going to put the caliper back on top of the carrier again, just so it's nice and safe and not slipping anywhere. So this is the brake pad that is on the inside of the caliper, and you'll see it's got two retaining plugs that go inside the twin pistons on the brake caliper. So when you're trying to remove this brake pad, if it feels stuck or stiff, give it a good tug, because it'll be these two retaining clips that are holding it in place. And those pistons, if I can show you on this caliper and what their job is, are sitting right here and here. Now they're looking quite corroded, so I'm going to clean up the face so that they're not binding and sticking onto the new back of the pads. Give this all a good clean up as well. But to get the new pads on, they're going to be a lot thicker. And because they're thicker, what I need to do is push these pistons back into their housing. So how do I push those pistons back into the housing? Well, I've got this little gadget here, and the idea is this part puts pressure against the piston to push it back into the housing by putting this on the inside of the caliper, and then you literally turn it, and the force of this against the caliper and this against the piston pushes the piston back in, which is why it's important that you must remember to remove the cap off the brake fluid, so it's got a bit of give in the system to allow those pistons to retract. Also worth inspecting the two rubber gaiters that the guide pins slide into to make sure there's no leaks in those and any losses or cracks, because obviously that could let foreign objects in and damage to your guide pins.
I am going to use this piston retraction tool, and the principle is that the round end goes against the piston and the plate slots behind the outer edge of the caliper, and you tighten it, which forces the pistons into their housing.
So I hope you can see the piston is returning to the housing. Very slowly, but it is going back. So that means that my pistons are not seized, which is also good. Here's the new outer pad. I'm going to offer that up for size.
When fitting the new outer brake pad, it should be noticed that you install this into the caliper carrier rather than the caliper itself. Also, add a small amount of copper grease to the end of the brake pads that come into contact with the caliper carrier here and here, so they can move backwards and forwards with the caliper. Be careful not to get any on the braking side of the pad surface.
Before refitting the caliper, make sure you apply some copper grease to the back of the pad to stop it binding.
Now repeat the installation process on the inner brake pad by greasing the ends to slide along the caliper carrier guides and push the brake pad into the pistons until you feel them engage.
Place the caliper now, it's been retracted.
Provided you have retracted the pistons enough, the caliper should fit over the disc once again. But before cleaning up the guide pins, let's look at the inner brake pad on the passenger wheel and the difference with the brake wear sensor.
Here's the passenger side inner brake pad. And I'm covering this because you'll notice this one has got a cable attached to it. This cable is the brake pad wear indicator. It will only be on one side of the car. It's on the passenger side on mine. So we need to remove this. And you can see it's held in place with a little clip. And the way I got mine off was I put a screwdriver just round the back, just prised it down slightly. And it will wiggle off. And you can see some daylight through it now. Give it a wiggle and out it pops. Now this threads through the caliper, and if I get the caliper here, you can see there's a hole at the back of the caliper. So make sure that this is threaded through that hole, like so, before you refit the brake pad. Here we go, one guide pin. I'm going to put a bit of brake cleaner on it, in case a lot of this is brake dust. I'm now going to take the rotary tool, metal brush, so there we go, literally 2 minutes on the rotary tool, and that is like perfect, no pitting. If we compare that to the one I've not yet done, you can see all of this around the bottom is what I've cleaned off of this one. Guide pins having a good coating of some copper grease. First one, and insert it all the way through the caliper.
If the caliper is fairly loose due to the retracting pistons, it may take some wiggling to align the guide pin holes when refitting the caliper. When tightening the guide pins, I managed to get a thin bar onto my torque wrench and tighten to the recommended torque of 25 Newton meters.
With the caliper now refitted, we should next give the whole disc a clean with some brake and clutch cleaner, because you've been handling the disc and you don't want to be putting foreign material onto the disc. When it comes to replacing your retaining clip, I would put it back in the way it comes off, which I find is this bit first. So make sure this is hooked around the back of the carrier, like so. Put the bottom piece in first, then pull back with some pressure. Clip it in the top, make sure that's all connected as well. And that's it.
Last and by certainly no means least, please remember to tighten the brake fluid reservoir cap or you'll have no pressure and therefore no brakes.
So there you have it, my beginner's guide and experiences on changing the front brake pads on the 3.2 V6. Remember, your front brake pads are going to need some bedding in now, so take it easy for the first few miles. I hope you like what you've seen today. If you have, then please do give this video a thumbs up and also think about subscribing to my channel for more Audi TT Mk1 content. As always, thanks for watching, see you soon. Take care.